you want to turn in your homework now? Never? Was it hard?
Yes.
Seriously?
Yes.
Oh.
Couldn't figure out meters.
Okay.
I think that was the
Okay.
main problem.
Okay. What I'll try to do, if I have time at the end of lecture, I'll go through it. I got a couple via email. They looked like they were pretty good, but so it was a little challenging. Okay. This is the hard part. Well, maybe this will help. Okay. So let's kind of go through what the key thing we talked about last time was, and what we're going to focus on today is, this is what we call intraspecific cooperation. These scrub jays in Florida are helping one another, and the brothers and sisters are helping to raise their brothers and sisters and helping mom and dad. And that's an example of sort of what we call intraspecific cooperation, members of the same species. And then the next lecture is going to focus on interspecific cooperation. And so what was the key thing that we noted here? What happens in the West? They breed on their own, right? In Florida, they do this cooperative breeding, where the individuals stick around their territory for a while. And the first thing you'd want to know, I think, nope, wrong way, is do these, by having helpers at the nest, do they actually help any, right? Do they, and how might you want to measure that? And that might be the benefit that you might think about, right? So if you look at it here, this is from 1970 to 1979. In fact, this study is still going on, so they have over many years of data. And the lines that connect solid circles are nests that have helpers at the nest. And there are some territories where there's just a male and a female. Maybe they just opened up, they just first started breeding. They don't have any sons and daughters. So a lot of times you have individuals, these are the open circles and the dashed lines connect them. That's the nest success, and the fledglings prepare, that's the number of offspring that come out of a nest and become independent. So those are the fledgling per pair. And what you'll notice is, in fact, well, yes, they do help. By having helpers at the nest success is much higher. It's usually about 25 to 30% higher if you have helpers at the nest. If you look at fledglings per pair, here's the average, a little over 2 in 1970. If you have a helper at the nest, it's about 3.5. So you do see a real benefit by having helpers at the nest. And what do you think they do? They feed, they protect the nests maybe from predators and things like that. So there's some real benefit having these helpers at the nest. Okay. So when you think about benefits here, they're showing some real benefits, right? So you could say, oh, you know, whatever number you want to put in there, you could put in 1, right? And then what's the R in this value, in this case? Who are they helping? You can think about it either way, parents or their brothers and sisters. Either way, R is going to be a half, okay? Now, what are the costs? That's the hard part too, right? What's that C? How is that C measured? How's it defined? Right, by not having their own. So it's kind of this cost in terms of direct fitness, actually producing their own offspring or their own direct descendants. That's how we measure cost, right? Okay. So what do you think happens here? What did we say about the habitats in here? They're saturated, right? It's very hard to find breeding territories. If you left your local area and tried to find another one, you'd probably die, right? Because these scrub habitats are very isolated, they're small, and they're probably hard to find. So it's very hard to go off on your own, especially outside of the breeding territory, okay? So here's kind of the summary sheet. This kind of outlines the costs and benefits of solitary versus cooperative breeding in Florida versus that western United States. Here's the key feature. There's a limited availability of breeding territories in Florida. That is, they're saturated, they're at high density, they're all packed into this available habitat. There's a high risk of mortality if you leave the local habitat in Florida because these scrub oak habitats are small and isolated from other such habitats. Okay, here's the key thing. The cost in terms of loss of direct fitness in Florida is extremely low because there's a low probability of producing your own offspring, right? So that's kind of hard to understand, but the cost in terms of loss of direct fitness is extremely low, right? It's very hard to produce your own offspring, so you might as well just stick around, raise your siblings, and that sort of thing. That is not true in the western United States. There are plenty of breeding territories, and the cost in terms of loss of direct fitness is high. That is, you can actually go off on your own, find your own breeding territory, and not be sort of dealing with your brothers and sisters all the time, and you go off, and you can actually produce your own direct descendants. So that cost is relatively high in the western United States. So the basic idea here is that cooperative breeding is favored in Florida because there's a high benefit to help to raise your siblings, and there's a really low probability of being able to produce your own offspring. So what do you think happens, though? Do you think these, after a while, you can't have, 10 siblings in a breeding territory, right? That's sort of what I fully don't quite understand quite yet, but basically what happens, what do you think happens? Sometimes breeding territories in Florida open up. Guess what happens? They go off and try to, find a mate, try to find a mate locally. And what happens a lot of times is these helpers they'll move to another breeding territory to become an independent breeder, mate with another individual, and start producing their own offspring. So it's kind of a plastic thing. This isn't fixed, that they are always going to be cooperative breeders, yeah. Yeah, usually what the mother and father really try to in general, these seem to be lifelong breeders, lifelong bond. But on occasion, obviously, a mother or father might get picked off or die, right? So then that's another way a breeding territory can open up, and obviously it wouldn't be, brothers and sisters wouldn't mate with their mother and father, but they would, anytime this happens, these breeding territories open up, okay? So does that answer your question? Okay. So I'm going to come back to my haplodiploid thing, and that's a little harder, okay? But maybe I'll just make it worth bonus points instead of homework. I'll see how you're doing. What do you want? I'll see how you're doing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll try, see if I have time, I'll try to come back to that. Okay. So there we were talking about intraspecific cooperation. What we're going to talk about today is, the first part of the lecture is, we're going to be talking about coevolution today. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about are what are called mutualisms, and these are mutualisms between individuals of different species, okay? And so we call this interspecific cooperation. We're also going to talk about another component of coevolution, which is not necessarily cooperative between species, but is what we call antagonistic coevolution. And at the end, I don't think I'm going to get to all of this. We'll be talking about predator-prey interactions. These are antagonistic interactions between members of different species, and also host-parasite interactions are also antagonistic interactions that can lead to coevolution. And basically, what we mean by coevolution is members of each species that are interacting with one another mutually influence each other's evolution and cause evolutionary changes in the other species, and that's what we call coevolution. And there are plenty of examples of sort of things that co-evolve and cooperate with one another. Obviously, plant and pollinators do this on a regular basis, right? where bees provide a service to the plant, and the plants in exchange provide something for them. The plants can provide nectar or pollen, whatever it is, some sort of nutrient or benefit or energetic source. And then these bees provide some sort of service, and primarily in terms of pollination, right? And they're classic examples of all kinds of interspecific interactions that are mutualistic. And we all believe these are very nice, mutually beneficial, right? Well, not always. And what we're going to talk a little bit about is a lot of these mutualisms really evolved out of antagonistic interactions and became mutualistic after a series of events. Sometimes these things happened where one of the partners got something from the other partner, but it wasn't at much cost to the other partner, and then it evolved into some sort of mutualism. Some mutualisms are very obligate. These two species only coexist with one another, and that's about it. Some are what we call facultative mutualisms, and we're going to be talking about a whole series of these. So when we talk about mutualism, in general, we define it pretty simple. We're going to be looking at coevolution in mutualism. Mutualism is an interaction in which all partner species benefit from the interaction. So there's a mutually benefit, okay? As I mentioned, some mutualisms are facultative. Partners benefit but do not require one another for their existence or their livelihoods or their functioning. A few mutualisms tend to be obligate, and we're going to focus on some of these, where partners have an absolute requirement, these partner species have an absolute requirement for each other for survival and reproduction, and in the absence of the other species, things don't go well, okay? And these are what we're going to focus a lot on, sort of obligate mutualisms, because those are kind of interesting. So these are a whole series of examples of mutualism in terms of mitochondria, right, or eukaryotes and bacteria involved in cellular energy. Chloroplasts are basically mutualisms between cyanobacteria that got incorporated by eukaryotes to provide photosynthesis. Mycorrhizae are examples of plants and fungi these are interacting species, obligate mutualisms that are very important. We're going to talk a little bit about fungus gardens, which are these sort of obligate interactions between ants and fungi. And obviously pollination between plants and animals is important. Seed dispersal. Seeds get dispersed by animals from plants, and that's often another example of sort of a mutualism, okay? And again, what they involve are sort of interactions between partner 1 and partner 2, whatever group, and they each mutually influence their survival and growth of each other, okay? So this is kind of a context of kind of the general, kind of the major groups of mutualisms that we see in nature. One we call energy nutrient mutualism, and that's where one partner often provides protection, the other provides a limiting resource. We'll be going through examples of these. Other provides a limiting resource, or each partner provides a complementary resource, and we'll talk about that. Pollination is an obvious one. Dispersal is another one, especially plants provide resources. There's some attraction, right, to something eating that fruit that has seeds in it, and that disperser puts the seeds, that animal or whatever thing, moves it into favorable environments. And then another thing we're going to talk about are kind of protection mutualisms, where one partner provides a service and then the other protects it from exploitation, especially by predators or parasites or all these sorts of things. So we'll kind of be hitting on all of these. This is, to me, one of the most fascinating groups of obligate mutualisms, and this involves ants. And these are basically fungal. These are ants that, this has all been dated, this phylogeny. This group of ants is basically about 50 million years old, okay? They've dated the origin of this group back at this node based on molecular data is about a 50 million year old association between ants and fungi, okay? They're all different kinds, and your book doesn't go into all the details, but there are basically 5 different kinds of sort of these ant fungal mutualisms. One involves lower agriculture. This is a different kind of fungus. Some sort of grow yeast, and others. We're going to focus primarily on these sort of leaf cutter ants, okay? And they call it leaf cutter agriculture. And so this is a group primarily of neotropical, Central and South America, and even some up into Texas and Mexico even. These are leaf cutter ants, and they do something kind of unusual. Do you know what they do? They cut leaves, and they cut lots of leaves in the tropics. They bring them back. They're a eusocial organism. They bring them back to their nest, and they use the decomposition of this plant material by this fungi as a food source, okay? And these are called leafcutter ants, and basically it's an agricultural system that these things have been using for years and years and years, millions and millions of years. So obviously there are benefits to this interaction. When you think about it from the ant's perspective, what do they get out of it? Yeah, they get nutrients, right? And the way they do it is the fungi are breaking down the plant material, and they're producing filamentous things, hyphae and things like that, and the ants use these hyphae, and they harvest them and eat them to feed their offspring, to eat themselves, and so they use this fungi as a source of food, okay? What do the fungi get out of it? They get a source of food, right? So these ants are bringing back, as an agricultural product, they're bringing back these leaves, and the fungi are growing, right? They're reproducing and all these sorts of things, and within the context of this garden, within this ant colony. And so this is a very clear obligate mutualism. Your book doesn't go into all the details, but if you look at each one of these species, there's a specific species of fungus that's associated with each one of those ant species. And they've sort of co-speciated together, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that later. But here's another thing, though. When you imagine about what's going on in this ant colony, that's great. Everything's great. But do you think other things might want to take advantage of that sort of situation? There are lots of things that probably would like to also have access to that fungi, okay? And so it turns out that people noticed a while ago that here's a leaf-cutting ant, and they've noticed in all these things, and you never see it on any other ants, you see these white spores on a certain part of the body, and actually they're little invaginations in their exoskeleton that house all these various kinds of bacteria, okay? And it turns out, as they did more and more research, so here's where it is, here's a close-up, and here's what it looks like in here. It turns out that these ants are housing bacteria that produce specific antibiotics that suppress parasite growth in the fungal garden. Okay, so you can imagine what happens in these systems between these mutually beneficial things. Other things try to exploit them and take advantage of it. And so it's even more complex than this, but here you have these attine ants, these army ants, or the leaf-cutting ants, okay? The basidiomycete fungi, these are the things they're cultivating. The basidiomycete fungi, these are the little things they're breaking down the plants, and the attine ant, this is the mutually beneficial interaction between these two species, okay? These are eating this, and obviously the fungi are getting a food source on a fairly regular basis from the ants by bringing back these leaves to the colony, okay? So turns out there's also, one of the things is, this is the bacteria that's on certain parts of the body of the leaf-cutting ants, and this is an actinomycete bacteria, okay? So this is that and it turns out each species has a particular kind of bacteria, that actinomycete bacteria. And what it's doing is these things are used to suppress this parasitic fungi, the Escovopsis fungi. So this fungi right here, guess what it likes to eat? It likes to eat this stuff, okay? So this fungus is a parasite. This is negative value. This thing has a negative effect on this, and the ingestion of this by that has a positive effect on the parasite. So obviously the parasite's trying to exploit it, trying to use it. And then what the attine ants have done is they've cultivated this particular kind of bacteria that kills this thing, okay? So there are a lot of interactions that are going on in this colony, and then it turns out, guess what's down here? There's a black yeast that is also an enemy of this and creates some problems. Okay, but we're not going to talk too much about that. So within this sort of mutualistic interaction, you have a lot of potential for exploitation by other species and these sorts of things. But in general, you have this very positive obligate mutualism between the leaf-cutting ants and the fungi that they cultivate. And it's very specific. Here's one of the other great examples of sort of mutualism. It's in general not as obligate, but it's an important one. And this involves interactions between an ant and a butterfly. And these are called butterfly-ant mutualisms. Okay. Now the mutualism is not between this ant and the adult butterfly, but it's between the ant and the larvae that this female butterfly puts on a host plant. Okay. So butterflies, obviously, females lay their eggs on particular host plants. Those things hatch, they become larvae, they feed on the host plant. They're a sedentary phase during that time, so they're feeding on the plant. And you can imagine, do you think larvae are susceptible to anything? Birds. It's the biggest thing that butterfly larvae are most susceptible during that phase before they pupate and leave the host plant. They're especially vulnerable to wasps. There's a whole group of wasps called parasitoid wasps that go around looking for butterfly larvae, and they lay their eggs inside that larvae, and the parasitoid larvae eat the host, the butterfly larvae, and kill it. So there's a whole group called the parasitoid wasp, and these are these things that have long abdomens, long ovipositors, and they specialize on laying their eggs in insect larvae and killing their hosts. Okay. So what do you think? So the interaction is between this ant and the host, the butterfly larvae. What do you think what has to happen here? It has to be mutually beneficial, right? So each partner has to provide something to each other. What do you think the ant's providing to the butterfly larvae? Huh? Yep, protection from the wasps. Okay? This is the hypothesis, and it's been documented in all sorts of ant-butterfly mutualisms, that in fact these ants, and we'll show you the data, these ants are protectors against these primarily parasitoid wasps, and they will prevent those parasitoid wasps from getting on the larvae and injecting their eggs into them. Okay? Do you think they just do this just to be nice? They probably want something in return. And what it turns out is those larvae actually, at their rear end, they secrete a sugary solution out of their butt. I use the nice term, anus, okay? So they secrete a nectar solution or sugary solution that the ant larvae feed from, okay? So what happens is the butterfly larvae are producing this sugary solution, and that's the benefit that the ants get from that interaction. So clearly, the butterfly larvae are having to give up a lot of stuff in order to get the protection from the ants. And it's very clear, people did the studies, if you prevent the ants from going there and you don't produce any nectar and you have some that produce nectar, the ones that produce nectar, the larvae grow very slowly. They sort of pupate at a much smaller size. There's a real, you have to put energy into providing the services to the ants and providing this protection. Okay. So one thing you'd want to know is, and this seems really obvious, is do an experiment where you have ants present and no ants. And then you look at the mortality of the butterfly larvae. This is for kind of their early larval stage to the 5th larval stage, and then they pupate. And this was done in Australia, 2 different sites. Does it look like having ants around are a good thing? Yeah. It's a really, really strong benefit, especially in this one, okay? If you look at this Canberra site, the mortality, if you don't have any ants around, can range anywhere from about 70% to over 95%, a really high mortality. If you have ants present, you have really low mortality of the butterfly larvae. So they're providing a very good protection service, primarily in this case against these parasitoid wasps. So they're really providing this, a very mutually beneficial thing to the larvae. Okay. And obviously, the ants are getting something out of it. They're getting that sugary solution, and that helps with their reproduction and survival. Now we're going to shift to, everything looks good, right? Cooperation, everything's great. Well, things like to exploit mutualisms, and it always doesn't work too well. So, and this statement is really not true. I shouldn't have said this. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of mutualisms originated as exploitation, okay? That one partner was getting something out of it, and then there was an interaction to change so that they become kind of mutually beneficial. But there's a lot of cheating that goes on to take advantages of mutualists, right? And here's kind of a classic example, right? Guess what these bees are doing? The bees are obviously providing a pollinator service. They get a reward out of it in terms of nectar, in this particular case, not necessarily just pollen. Guess what they're doing? Do you see where they are? Most of their pollinators go up in through this area to get the nectar, or go in through that opening, and the nectar is down at the bottom. Guess what they're doing? They're going straight for the nectar. Okay? So what they're doing, this one right here is basically piercing the base of this corolla in this flower and sucking the nectar out. Is it providing any pollinator services? No. So a lot of these mutualisms are open to exploitation, and bees often are illegitimate flower visitors, and they learn how to exploit flowers for which they provide no pollination services. Okay. Now, obviously, this can't become really common, do you think? And there'd be major problems for the plant if this continued, if there were no pollination services. So these sorts of things, what people find is these sorts of cheaters that exploit mutualisms tend to be fairly infrequent, fairly rare, and it's not a big deal. So, okay. Here's one of the other classic examples of how these interactions can change. So this is a group of moths that are they're pollinators, but they do weird things. Do you guys know anything about yucca plants or yucca moths? You ever heard of those? If you've ever been in the Southwest or in Arizona or parts of Mexico, you have these big plants with these big inflorescence, big white flowers. You even see them around here, but they're really common in the Southwest. They're called yucca plants, and every once in a while they produce these big stalks of flowers. Turns out they have these obligate pollinators in this particular moth family called Prodoxid moths. And it turns out yucca plants produce a flower. They only have a specific kind of pollinator that's called a Prodoxid moth. And what happens in this particular moth is in the same family as these yucca moth pollinators. It turns out what these things do is really weird. What yucca moth pollinators do is they go to the plant, they go to the top, and they grab some pollen, right? They then go down into the base of the flower, and instead of getting nectar, what they do is they turn around and they take their ovipositor and they inject their eggs into the flower, into the ovaries of the plant. And then their larvae eat the seeds. So this is a really weird, this is an example of what you see here. This is this Prodoxid moth that's doing some pollination, but instead of getting nectar or pollen as the resource, guess what its resource is? It's eating the seeds of the host plant. So you might be asking yourself, does that seem weird? The host plant is actually giving up its offspring to have a pollinator. That's pretty weird. Okay. So here's what's kind of interesting in this particular study. In the habitats where this moth is the only pollinator, right? And I believe, I can't remember, I forgot to look in the book. I think it's the ones in red, or maybe it's blue, right? Where this host plant, in this population of this host plant, this particular moth is its only pollinator, okay? let's say in the orange, not only is there this moth pollinator, but there's there are a bunch of other pollinators there. So the question is, what should happen here? What happens here is, in those habitats in blue, where the gray moth is the only pollinator, this is the plant species, Lithophragma. It tolerates seed predation by the larvae. What it does is it provides seeds in exchange for pollination. So that's the only pollinator it gets. It has to give up some of its seeds to have pollination. Now, the question you might be asking yourself, why isn't it producing nectar, but it turns out these particular plants don't seem to have any capability of producing nectar. Okay. In other habitats, what do you think is going to happen in the other habitats where there are other pollinators present? Should they tolerate that kind of pollinator that eats its seeds? No, it turns out in habitats with other pollinator, Lithophragma has higher fitness if it does not sacrifice the seeds. And actually what it does in those habitats, let's say orange is the one that has other pollinators, when this thing goes in and lays its eggs in there, it actually aborts the flower. It doesn't allow any seed predation to occur. So it basically eliminates it from the population. Okay, so here it's kind of a mutualism, right? It's mutually beneficial when there's only one pollinator around, but it actually changes to another kind of dynamic where if there are other pollinators around, it now becomes really negative to have that as a pollinator, and it actually gets rid of it. So it becomes kind of exploitative in that case. Man, I am whipping through this. Maybe too fast. Okay. You want to do an eye clicker? Okay, let's do eye clickers. Okay. They said this was moderate. So I don't know. I thought it was easy. Okay. What is the role of the bacteria found in the whitish gray cusps on the ants who tend fungal gardens? A, the bacteria infect the ants, preventing overpopulation by the ants, which would deplete their fungal food source. The bacteria infect and kill other insects who try to exploit the ants' fungal garden. The bacteria prevent parasite infection of the ants. The bacteria provides antibiotics that target diseases dangerous to the fungal garden. Everybody in? Nope. That was easy, wasn't it? What do you think? Huh? D, yep. Oh, okay. Okay, let's see. What's wrong with C? The bacteria prevent parasite infection of the ants. Really, it's really the things are infecting the fungi, right, and not directly the ants. And then the bacteria infect and kill other insects. There aren't any other insects in the colony. So D was the best answer. They provide the antibiotics that target that one particular fungus that tends to eat their preferred food. Okay. So this is the study. I don't have all the details, but that's the graph I just showed, where based on the data provided, what type of coevolutionary relationship exists between the butterfly larvae and those ants that protect them. Is it A, antagonistic? Is it B, intraspecific cooperation? Is it C, interspecific cooperation? Or is it D, a mosaic coevolution? Let me, okay. They said this was easy. It's between two of them, isn't it? Okay. I'll stop in a minute. Okay. Which one? C. Yep. That's interspecific cooperation. I can't get the... Okay. Well, I don't know what happened to the graph. iClicker problems. Anyway, it's interspecific competition because it's interaction between two species rather than within species.